Chaos. Is it any way to run a war? I'm Scott Ott, and this episode of Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. I'm with Stephen Green and Bill Whittle. And gentlemen, as we record this on Tuesday, the 8th of October, events and statements are constantly moving. Everything is in flux. On Sunday, we learned that the president of the United States had spoken with the president of Turkey, President Erdogan, and that the United States would be pulling troops out of Northern Syria, jeopardizing our Kurdish allies. They're part of that Syrian defense force that has helped us to fight ISIS for many years now. Since then, there have been several statements coming out of the White House that seem like retractions or changes in plans. There was one statement that indicated that only about a dozen U.S. troops that were along some border posts would be removed. And then the President Trump himself said that if Turkey invaded Northern Syria and jeopardized the Kurds, that he, in his great wisdom, would destroy their economy. So all of this, guys, and I know I'm doing a terrible job describing this because, frankly, I've been bewildered reading stories. I've read a couple of dozen stories about this, and it just seems like there's no overall strategy, no plan, and that even allies like Israel, who frankly live over in that region of the world, were blindsided by this, along with people at the Pentagon, people in the White House, people in the president's party in Congress. Even Lindsey Graham, his stalwart defender, has stood up and criticized the president and said that we should not have suddenly unleashed this kind of a statement. Bill Whittle, I don't even know how to approach this to ask a question, but doesn't the commander-in-chief of the forces of the United States military have an obligation, at the very least, to our own people to make clear our actions and our intent, and to never surprise the people who are going to be responsible in a military way for carrying out the president's civilian orders?
Yes.
And how do you grapple with this? Like, how do you get out? Let me ask it this way. Rather than, I'm not looking for a critique of President Trump. What I'm looking for is, at this point, with so much confusion sown, what could the White House do? What could the president do now?
I understand. I think this is a case where, for me personally, I remember when O.J. Simpson walked, I thought it was an outrage. I knew he did it. Everybody knew he did it. And the only way I could console myself watching him grinning as he walked out of the courtroom was to say, well, I've always said, better to let 10 guilty men go free than put an innocent man in jail. Yep. And there goes one of the 10. The reason I bring this up is to say that no system is perfect and that there are consequences for everything, and not all the consequences are good. Donald Trump's great strength is his ability to basically shoot from the hip, and I mean that in a good way. If somebody attacks him, he responds. He's got a very quick wit, and he's got a very combative nature. Those are the qualities that make him, I think, indispensable, especially at the time he arrived on the scene. That kind of feistiness, that kind of unwillingness to take things lying down, I think is his great strength. But like every other human being on the planet, what sometimes are strengths can occasionally be weaknesses. It seems to me that this was an impetuous move. It was not a well thought out move, and that this is the price you pay for this man. And I think you could look at any president, any leader, any human being at all, and look at them and say, the people who you like or you cherish, who you think are good bosses or good employees or whatever, you look at them and you say, this person is an asset and I like this person. But that's not to say that this person is perfect. It's not to say this person doesn't make mistakes or do things that I don't like. That kind of world doesn't exist. And that's my main take on this. I think this is a mistake. And I may be wrong and I may be right. But the point is that this is the world. We take what we're given and we have to do the best with what we've got. As I say, I think this is a consequence of Donald Trump's fundamental character. And this is, in my opinion, this is one case where that character is hurting the interests of the United States. But I cannot give you a case of a person who didn't have those conflicts. every great leader, Winston Churchill, made enormous blunders, and he made blunders in a Churchillian way. And that's the point I'm trying to get here, is that you have this product, which is the President of the United States, and no product is faultless, and certain products have their own faults. Barack Obama's faults were that he was just nothing but rhetoric and nothing but total lack of commitment. Donald Trump seems to be in the opposite end of the spectrum, and sometimes that can get you into trouble. I don't like this move. I'm not happy about it. And I'm especially not happy about the way it was pulled off. And if that's the price we pay for Donald Trump, then that's the price we pay for Donald Trump.
Stephen Green, it seems that to an extraordinary extent, perhaps greater than any president in recent memory, President Trump keeps his own counsel, surrounds himself with, in some cases, excellent people, and then seems to pay little, if no attention to the advice that they give him.
Yes.
Nikki Haley, the former UN ambassador, said we must always have the backs of our allies. Leaving them to die is a big mistake. We recall that back in December of 2018, when the president first announced his intention to pull U.S. forces out of Syria, that in effect sparked the departure of Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, also of Brett McGurk, who's a special envoy to that whole U.S. ISIS effort over there. Yep. It just seems like you got the White House press secretary, Stephanie Grisham, saying that U.S. troops will not support or be involved in an operation where the Turks are coming in there and will no longer be in the area. And then we have President Trump, and I'm just referring to my notes here, President Trump tweeting, "The Kurds fought with us," and then goes on to say, "They were paid massive amounts of money and equipment to do so. It's time to get out of these ridiculous, endless wars, many of them tribal, and bring our soldiers home." And then later he says, "If the Turks go too far," and this is a quote, "in my great and unmatched wisdom," end quote, "I will destroy their economy." Stephen Green, we're perhaps the last remaining superpower on earth. Is there a degree of circumspection and sobriety and reliability that we ought to have, at least on the home front? I don't care if our enemies feel like we're being chaotic. What I care about is when our friends don't know where we stand.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Wow. The first thing I think is interesting is what people read into this. Bill looks at this, and I'm inclined to agree with Bill on this, that you see Trump's strength being a weakness in this case. And on the other side, whether you're a Democrat or a never Trumper or whatever, you look at this as an indication that he is corrupt through and through, and that everything he touches is the reverse Midas touch, the Mayor touch, I guess maybe you'd call that. As I said, I'm inclined to agree with Bill on that point. In fact, no, I completely agree with Bill on that point. But on this issue of impetuousness, making predictions about what's going to happen in the Middle East is a fool's game. And if there's any lesson we should have taken going back to September 11, 2001, it's exactly that. The Democrats like talk about our rush to war in Iraq in 2003, except that it was an 18-month deliberative process that involved the United Nations, it involved the Congress, it involved everybody from early bloggers such as yours truly going on and on about this for 18 months. We learned that it was easier to defeat Iraq than to tame Iraq. We learned that going in light is a big mistake. It turns out that occupations, like with V8 engines, that there's no replacement for displacement. Obama came in and looked at the chaos that had been sown in the Middle East and decided with his deliberative process that the solution was to embolden and strengthen Iran and weaken the Israelis and the Arab states in an attempt to sort of fine-tune this perfect balance that would somehow bring the peace. And instead, and also to encourage the Arab street to rise up, to get people's governments or whatever throughout the Arab world. That ended up almost destroying Egypt. It did destroy Libya. It turned Syria into a slaughterhouse. It turned Iran into an imperial power stretching from Beirut to Tehran, all the way down to Yemen, which is also engaged in another civil war, which is also being used as a base for offenses against the Saudis. So we look at what has become of these finely tuned deliberative decisions, and it's been an absolute mess. Maybe something better will come out of Trump's impetuous decision. I don't know. What I do know is that I'm out of the business of making predictions about the Middle East because nobody can do it.
And I want to make this clear. I was an early critic of candidate Donald Trump, and I was not a supporter of him. I did not vote for his election. That said, the moment he was elected, my decision was that he's the president of the United States, duly elected, constitutionally elected, and I will evaluate what he does based on what he does, not based on any previous feelings I had about his candidacy. I have praised him in many circumstances with things that I thought were impressive. In this situation, what I'm afraid of is that, as Bill hinted at earlier, that there are far too many supporters of the president who feel it's some kind of breach of faith for you to look at something he does in a particular circumstance with a critical eye. And I think when we suspend judgment in that way, or worse yet, when we take every chaotic action of an impetuous executive as if it were some sort of four-dimensional chess game and he's smarter than the rest of us and he's figured out something that none of us know, I think we risk putting ourselves in some very dangerous situations. The fact that there are so many ISIS prisoners in the hands of the Kurds who, at least for some period of hours this week, had to wonder whether the United States of America had their back anymore. It is easy to see those gates opening up once the Turks come in and those people flooding out again and dispersing over the Middle East and having a free hand to commit acts of terror again. You cannot conduct yourself on the international scene without a steady hand. Yes, you walk softly. Yes, you carry a big stick, but you need to have a reliable reputation for ethical behavior that your enemies can trust and that your friends can trust. They have to know what you mean when you make a promise, and they have to know that you're good for that promise. And right now, I think that at least, again, 72 hours or whatever it's been since this whole thing blew up, President Trump must quickly step up and take the lead. He must apologize for the confusion. He must give clarity as to the United States' intentions. He must make sure that President Erdogan in Turkey knows that there are lines he may not cross. He must make sure that the Kurds, who we have supported and who are not running some sort of a scam where they're profiting off their willingness to fight against ISIS, but whom we have supported and have been partners with us in defeating ISIS, those Kurds need to know where we stand as well. And frankly, the terrorists and the Russians need to know where we stand. That's all I'm asking of the president at this point. Make it clear what you believe, stand up for what you believe, and don't surprise your own people when you go to war. When you become so insular in that White House that literally everybody is the enemy, the media is the enemy, Congress is your enemy, our enemies are your enemy, our friends are your enemy, and you get to the point where there is nobody that you can turn to and receive counsel from, and there is nobody that you can even tell in advance when you plan to do something, you can't run a country that way. You may have been able to run a business that way. You can't run a country that way. Mr. President, get a grip. I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green. This has been Right Angle.